social media for you.
Okay, we might, it's just on 12:30 and I think I've been told the webinar's up and running, so we might make a start. So welcome today to this Insight session. This has been organised by the Leadership and Career Development Subcommittee. Our objective of our committee is to promote the soft skills and non-technical skills that make our members more valuable in business, as actuaries, and just in the community. So when we talk about leadership skills, we're thinking about thought leadership as well as leadership of people as teams. So we're thinking that skills that are relevant to make members more valuable, not just people who want to manage teams. So part of the committee's responsibility is to raise awareness of what we mean by those technical and soft skills, and to encourage our members to be proactive in thinking about them in their career progression. So today we've got two renowned actuaries, Blair Nicholls and Anthony Lowe, to help share their journey, give us a bit of insight into some of the challenges they've faced along the way as leaders, and hopefully some tips. So I'll just give you a bit of background on both of them. I've got their bios here. So Blair is currently working on a startup venture in distribution for health and motor insurance. This venture expects to start selling insurance later this year. In his previous role, Blair was responsible for Berkshire Hathaway Reinsurance in Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia. Blair has also started Berkshire Hathaway Specialty Insurance in Australia, selling both specialty lines and personal lines. The personal lines operation was sold to IAG in June 2015. Prior to this position in Berkshire, Blair was the Chief Actuarial Officer and Head of Reinsurance for the QBE Insurance Group. He ran the global reinsurance programs, business planning process, capital modelling, and was involved in many of the acquisitions completed by QBE. Blair joined QBE in '94 and held various senior management roles. Anthony is the CEO at Prostate Cancer Foundation of Australia, a broad-based community organisation and the peak national body for prostate cancer in Australia, dedicated to reducing the impact of prostate cancer on Australian men, their partners and families, recognising the diversity of the Australian community. He's also the Adjunct Associate Professor at the Menzies Health Institute, Queensland, Griffith University, Non-Executive Director at Ensemble Offspring, and a member of the Actuaries Institute Leadership and Career Development and Public Policy Council Committees. Prior to joining the Prostate Cancer Foundation, Anthony was the Chief Operating Officer at the National Breast Cancer Foundation, the leading community-funded organisation in Australia, raising money for research into the prevention, detection and treatment of breast cancer. Anthony has held senior executive positions in the financial services industry in Australia, the US and UK, ultimately becoming the Executive Director and Asia Pacific Business Group Leader at Mercer Wealth Solutions. Anthony is a Fellow of the Institute of Actuaries and a Fellow of the Institute of Actuaries of London. Sorry, that's of Australia and London. He holds a PhD in Mathematical Physics from the University of Southampton and a Bachelor of Arts, Master of Arts and Master of Mathematics from the University of Cambridge. Lots of study by the sounds of it. So just join me in welcoming Anthony and Blair, yeah, looking forward to asking you a couple of questions and picking your brains. Thank you. So to start off, perhaps I could get both of you, maybe starting with you, Blair, just to give us a brief walk through your leadership journey.
Good. Yeah, that'd be a pleasure. If I go back a bit in time, and I can give you the direction I've been through and where I think it's made a difference and where I've learnt different things as far as leadership goes. I started at QBE in '94. Before that, I was in consulting as a consulting actuary. Originally in QBE, it was quite a small company in '94, and there was many insurance companies in Australia. I actually started out doing personal lines pricing at that stage, which was a little bit unusual. There wasn't many actuaries involved in doing personal lines pricing in insurance companies, and generally not many actuaries actually involved in general insurance companies. Most of them were involved in consulting at that stage in the general insurance industry. The thing which I think initially in my career made the biggest difference was how I put it or think about it is trying to be relentlessly enthusiastic about things and getting into things and not letting go of things, and trying to be positive about things. And that's probably initially a really important point to do. A lot of actuarial trainings about trying to figure out where the problems are and figure out solutions to issues. And sometimes we can get very focused on what the problems are and not necessarily trying to figure out solutions to issues, etc. So that, to me, I always enjoyed things about making change and improving on things, and that's what I enjoyed about roles. So I really tried to push that side of things about making positive changes to the business to make it better, and trying to identify areas in the business where I could see that we could probably make a change, of which there was lots available, and there always is lots available where you can make sort of a positive change in the business. So not sort of being the devil's advocate, but being a change advocate there. So that figuring out of what you think is going to make the biggest difference to the business and targeting it, and I'll use this word a few times today because I think it's important, just relentlessly looking at it and trying to make sure you achieve that. So having the tenacity there and the desire to move that direction. So that was sort of my early stages at QBE. Being QBE and the 90s, we looked at a number of acquisitions and things like that. I got involved in a lot of due diligence around acquisitions, etc. And then we made a merger of Australia between QBE's Australian operations and Mercantile Mutual, which I did a lot of work in getting that all together. And to my surprise, after saying this will work really well, they said, okay, go and make it work with myself and two other people, Terry Ibbotson, who ran it, and another actuary called Mike Goodman, who came from the Mercantile Mutual side. Which I thought, I mean, it was relatively scary for a relatively younger person at that stage, because you've never been in a position of, hey, you said it's going to work really well, now make it work really well. So that's a little bit interesting, but the thing to do is grab it and run with it and have a bit of back yourself to some extent, because the worst you can do ever in any of these types of things is lose your job, which is not that bad. And you have to be, I mean, any job you're in, I think you have to be not afraid to lose your job. You have to have the confidence yourself to back yourself. So that was a fairly big stage to sort through. At that stage, when we put the two organisations together, when we mapped it all out and figured out what we wanted to do, which we wanted to do very quickly, we sort of announced it in April '99. By September '99, we wanted to have it sorted, so we figured out pretty early on in the piece that we had about 1,000 roles or something like that. Unfortunately, we had about 1,500 people, so that was a fairly traumatic exercise to go through. At the time, I mean, you've got to be able to justify these things to yourself as well, in that it's better to have 1,000 people in a job than 1,500 people in not a job, because you're going broke with your expense ratio. So that did a lot for me as far as developing my leadership and trying to sort things through, and realising there's actually no really well-known path to solve all these problems. You don't have to come up with a lot of plans about it all necessarily. You need a macro plan, and you need to be able to sort that through in a fairly timely manner by making decisions. And a lot of the time, it doesn't actually matter if you choose A or B as far as which direction to go. People just need certainty and somewhere to some direction to call around, and so that everybody can run the same direction. It's actually more important to make the wrong decision and all run the same way than not make a decision at all and trying to figure out which way to go. The certainty behind that is really important, and if you always keep that in mind, and everything you're looking at is trying to give all the people who you work with, and leadership is all directions, and always keep that in mind. It's up, down, sideways. Try and give people certainty around what it is. It makes life so much easier to figure out which way to go and what to do. Fortunately, after that, we got that all together, and in a 2-year period we changed the company from having a 125% combined ratio down to a 98% combined ratio, with a fair bit of loss. We lost about 25% of the business during that period, but it's far better to make some money on a smaller business than lose money on a bigger business. The world changed fairly dramatically after that. We had, in the general insurance world, September 11, 2001, and that dramatically changed how things were priced across the whole world. In particular in Australia, we also had HIH occur at the same stage, so that allowed pricing to go up fairly significantly, and QBE in Australia went from strength to strength after that. I then moved across to London. We had 2 businesses in our London operation over there, and because I'd had some experience in merging businesses together, they said, try and do it again. So that was about a bit over half of QBE was the London operation at the time. So merged together those 2 operations. It was, again, it's something you have to be... the London operations are very different to Australian operations. You've got different people, different cultures, different ways of looking at things. So you've got to be able to be adaptable and think about how it best operates in each of the different areas. In London, we took 2 years doing over it, whereas in Sydney, we did it all in the 6 months. And that's just a cultural difference about how things operate and making sure that you retain what you want to retain through the whole process there. So again, it's just planning out what you think is the best course for it all. Following that, I came back to Sydney, and because it had been reasonably successful in doing those things previously, was invited to join the group executive for QBE, which was, I found, a fascinating thing to do. At that stage, QBE had also just done a couple of acquisitions in the US, so you had a fairly worldwide insurer. I spent way too long on aeroplanes, but did learn a lot in visiting all the different operations of QBE around the world. Particularly during the business planning processes and things like that, and therefore monitoring of the business plans, etc., which I found a great education, and also good to really learn about how to interact with a vast variety of different people which you get in all the different continents around the world. After being in QBE for a while, I joined Berkshire Hathaway in 2012. This was just after Berkshire Hathaway's reinsurance division initially. They had a lot of business being written in this end of the world, being Southeast Asia, but no office over here. They fundamentally were writing all their reinsurance out of London and New York, and decided to actually get somebody on the ground out in this end of the world, because it was taking too much time and effort to spend 2/3 of a year flying over to Asia and flying back again and things like that. So I was fortunate enough to... one of my roles in QBE, as Nikki said, was buying reinsurance, so I knew the reinsurance market quite well. So they got me to look after Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand as far as reinsurance goes for Berkshire Hathaway. I did that for a couple of years, and we saw there was a reasonable opportunity for starting up insurance as well in this area of the world, so started up the insurance operations for Berkshire Hathaway in Australia and New Zealand. And as Nikki said, we sold the personal lines operation of that to IAG a couple of years ago. Then worked for Berkshire for a bit longer, and then more recently decided to do a startup, which I've been working on recently. It's interesting, again, moving from being in big corporates of various descriptions. Although QBE was reasonably decentralised, particularly sort of under when Frank O'Halloran was CEO. Berkshire Hathaway is decentralisation on steroids, so there is very, very little support of any kind or control of any kind of what people do. So it's a really interesting culture to work in, although a massive organisation. And then moving into a small company of a startup nature, and then moving down that sort of pathway again, which I've been doing for the last few months, is fascinating as well. again, your leadership skills are a completely different set which is needed. I've always ranked leadership into three categories. One part of leadership is you've got to lead yourself and figure out what you're doing. And that's the easiest thing to do, because normally if you tell yourself to do something, you cooperate and do it. The next easiest area is when you've got a team reporting to you, because generally most of your team members will cooperate with you and work with you. The third area of sort of leadership is trying to lead others who don't report to you. That can be people or other people in the organisation, more senior, more junior, or sideways, etc., and trying to influence them to get the outcomes which are needed. So I've always tried to think about leadership in those three different categories, as far as trying to make sure that make sure you think about how you're leading and that you are actually approaching those three different areas. I think I learned a fourth one recently, which was going around trying to raise capital for a startup, which is trying to get people to give me money, which is a completely different area of leadership at all. But again, you're still trying to convince people to follow your idea and do what you want to do, and convince them that that's a great sort of area. So I think I've added that as a fourth area to my thinking as far as leadership goes. But the first three are probably the main ones to focus on.
Oh, very interesting, Blair. There's some interesting messages there with those non-technical skills of courage, backing yourself, and taking opportunities and being accountable and responsible, and adaptability. I'm sure courage is a particularly important one going on your new venture as well.
Thank you.
Anthony,
Thanks. Well, just start by talking a little bit about my career. I guess probably the important place to start is I didn't grow up thinking I would be Chief Executive of Prostate Cancer Foundation of Australia. And that's kind of an important theme for me today, because I kind of feel like my career's been a bit of a random walk, and I don't think that's a problem. I know quite a lot of quite successful people who would say the same thing about their careers. I think when we were studying probability at school, they used to talk about the drunk man's walk, but I'm not sure that we're allowed to say that anymore. So when I was 16, I wanted to be Erwin Schrödinger. And I didn't want to be Erwin Schrödinger because he scandalised 1930s Cambridge by turning up to college with both his wife and his mistress. I wanted to be Erwin Schrödinger because I thought his non-relativistic wave equation was really cool. So I got very interested in that, went off, did my degree, did my PhD, as you said, Nikki. And probably the first most important realisation for me, and I think that this is important for everybody actually, is if you want to play in that kind of elite game, you're a sportsman or whatever, you have to understand whether you're up for it or not. And I came to the understanding after 7 years at university that I'd been very successful at university, but I just actually hadn't got it to be Erwin Schrödinger or Albert Einstein or anybody like that. So, and I think it probably picks up a little bit on a theme of yours, Blair, which is you've got to be realistic about yourself. You've got to back yourself, but don't be unrealistic about how you back yourself as well. So I decided to train as an actuary. I went off to R. Watson & Sons in London Road, Reigate, and trained and did all of that. Came out to Australia and gradually got more sort of sucked up in management things, and that interested me, the leadership of people, but also the ability to sort of control the agenda and all of those kind of things. I 100% agree with what Blair says about positivity. I think that's enormously important. One of the things I've learned in my career is nobody likes, there's two things that people don't, there's probably more than two things that people don't like, but they don't like the person who's always kind of bitching at the back going, this isn't going to work because it isn't helpful. And they don't like and excuse my language, but they don't like what one of my former bosses at Mercer said, the master of the bleeding obvious, where you go, well, of course, this isn't going to work for all the following reasons. You've got to be, I think, you've got to be positive about things, even when you're actually disagreeing with people. You've got to find a way to frame that in a positive way. So I was invited by Mercer to go and work in the US and fix up a defined benefit administration business they had. And I went out and did that for 3 years, came back to Australia, and eventually, as you said, Nikki, ran Mercer Wealth Solutions, a superannuation and financial planning business. And I came to a point really where I thought, well, you know, I enjoy this, but I want to do something else. So I decided that I would see if I could get a job in the not-for-profit sector. And, you know, when you try to make a career change like that, you immediately think to yourself, well, at least I do, well, who the hell's going to employ me to do that? And how am I going to sell myself in? You're probably thinking a bit like that, trying to raise your capital. How the hell am I going to, you know, get these people to give me all their money? And so for me, and we might talk about this in a bit, it's a question of thinking about all those things you've done in the past, that random walk, thinking about all the skills and attributes, so actuarial training, PhD, mathematics background, all the other things I've done, and trying to, and I've done some technology projects when I was at AMP working with Accenture, and various other kind of totally random things that bosses of mine said, oh, Anthony, you could do this, that sort of thing, and try to package those together in terms of a sellable proposition. And my conclusion was, even though my aspiration was to be a chief executive of a not-for-profit, the only path to do that was through the business background and persuading people that I could be a chief operating officer. So I was lucky enough to get the job as Chief Operating Officer at National Breast Cancer Foundation, and that kind of opened up a path to be Chief Executive of Prostate Cancer Foundation in Australia. So I guess that's my journey. One other thing that, just to pick up on some things that Blair said, that I think would be interesting to talk about is that whole thing about leadership at different levels. So to me, having been a Chief Operating Officer, the leadership that you require is a bit different than the leadership that you require as a Chief Executive Officer. So, you know, there's a kind of a good cop, bad cop thing that goes on. I think, Nikki, you might want to talk in a minute about the experience I had shutting the office that I worked in Princeton, New Jersey, and there are some learnings there. But that's kind of Chief Operating Officer stuff. You know, the expectation of your bosses is that you will be Mr. Efficiency, you know, Mr. Ruthless, Mr. Get It Done, in a sense, Mr. Head Kicker, although I think there are some things about that that I'll talk about in a minute. But being Chief Executive, the expectation is you'll be everybody's friend, Mr. Nice Guy, listen to everybody, not shut people out because they're idiots, all of those kind of things. So I think that that's different. And then again, going on to be a non-executive director on a board, understanding that that's kind of different again, and it does give you a perspective, I think, of the, you know, the different roles at different levels. So the only other thing I wanted to say, and it picks up on what you said, Blair, is I think it's very important to kind of have integrity. I mean, sometimes as leaders, I know there are a few members of the actuarial profession, Wayne Brazel's one, and David Bell, although he's not an actuary, is another, who've had sort of military training and therefore leadership training, because apparently they're trained in leadership in the military. And I guess, I don't know, I haven't talked to them about it, but that includes leadership in defeat as well as leadership in victory, if you like. So how do you lead a group of people through the process of telling them that they've not got any jobs anymore and the office is closing? And I think that that's very important, the integrity of doing that. Because you talked about justifying it to yourself there, and of course that's right. But in the end, I mean, I got put in the position where I got told that's what I got to do. It doesn't matter whether I got to justify it or not. But I think even if that's the instruction you've been given and you've got no way out, it was the right thing to do, by the way, but you've got no way out. There's a right way and a wrong way to do it, and a right way to address the dignity of the people who work for you and make sure that you're communicating properly with them all the way through. Anyway.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, listening to your journey, I think it really resonates with one of the things that we've discussed about on the Leadership Committee, and that is proactively managing your career. And as you're progressing through your career, it sounds like you've had very considered thought about what you're doing, and you talk about having realistic views of your strengths and weaknesses. So it's...
I think I'm a bit more opportunistic, to be honest.
Oh, right, okay. Fair enough.
You have to be thoughtful as you seize the opportunity, I think is probably what I would say.
Yeah, yeah. So we might move on to my next question, which if you could give us examples of how you developed your leadership skills. Were there any sort of pivotal points where you felt that that was really useful in developing those skills, or were there any people who were inspirational to you? How did you go about developing your leadership skills? Might start with Anthony this time.
Okay. Well, I think probably the starting point for me is when I was a student in Cambridge and then in Southampton, I was quite involved in student politics, and you know, all my mates were involved one way and another, and I think that kind of gave me an insight into the process of negotiating with people and trying to influence people, and things that you might think, well, it's blindingly obvious we need to do this, but you can't actually get it done.
Force them to do it.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, I think we all, without going into the controversial stuff, I think we all probably reflect on Malcolm Turnbull and go, I think we probably know the sorts of things that he probably wants to do. But to be fair to him, he's leader of a party and he's following, you know, the decisions of his party, not his own conscience to a certain extent. So there are constraints all the time. So I think that was the first thing for me. And then I think this might sound kind of arrogant. I think it probably is actually. But for the first 9 years of my career, I didn't report to anybody because I worked for Watsons in the UK, and there were all these partners and they were much more important than anybody else. And in fact, if you were a main partner and owning partner, you could use a pencil and nobody else was allowed to. Very kind of hierarchical. And it didn't occur to me until I arrived in Australia that it was unusual not to have a line manager. So I had no kind of experience of that until I worked for AMP in the mid-90s. I actually hadn't had anyone reporting to me. And I think I just thought, I got handed this project by my then boss at AMP, working with Anderson Consulting, and he said, off you go and do this. And I kind of thought to myself, how hard can that be? I must be able to do that. And I think, sort of Blair's point, in a way, you've got to back yourself. And you kind of learn on the job, I think. I've not actually found, to be honest, might be controversial, that any of the various leadership training that I've ever been sent on, not that I've been sent on a huge amount, has been hugely helpful, because I think the best advice that I've ever heard from anybody is you've got to lead in your own style. And, you know, I've had plenty of bosses who've tried to sort of suggest that I'm doing it the wrong way because I'm not doing it like them. But that's one thing I refuse to sort of give up on, because I just don't think, you've got to be authentic, I think. And so I think you've just got to kind of follow your own course and try and learn from your mistakes and be thoughtful about what's happening.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So for you, it's been probably more than on the job than formalised courses and taking advantage of opportunities. Yeah, Blair.
As far as sort of developing a style, probably one of the main characteristics which everyone needs to consider every time something goes wrong is being resilient. Resilience within yourself and trying to take something which is going wrong as a learning and using it as a base to move forward on is one of the key characteristics I think most leaders need. It's very easy to pick holes in things, but it's a lot harder to actually figure out how things develop and go the right direction. So if you're, again, I'll use the word again, I said I'll use it a few times, be relentlessly resilient, which is a bit hard to say sometimes. Just keep on, if things go wrong, they go wrong, it's okay, but take the positives out of it and really push hard on the positives, because that's what's going to make a difference. As far as what sort of developed my style, I've had, I think probably the best learnings I've ever had would have been through on-the-job learnings, if I can put it that way. I really encourage people to try out things, do things which are different, and see if they work. And if they don't work, it really doesn't matter a lot of the time. Just explain to people what's happened and try something else. But as far as sort of formal training go, I've been through sort of executive MBAs and courses on leadership and all that sort of area. They're useful. The discipline I tried to put myself on, because it's really easy to go to a course and then just go back to work and nothing ever changes. every day for every day of training I've ever had, I try and implement one change in the office about what I do, or my workplace about what I do. If you get one change out of a whole days of training, I reckon you're going really, really well. That's about you're lucky to get that sort of ratio. You've got to try really, really hard to do that, in my view. So if you are going for any sort of formal training, try and actually do something different sometime within the next week or two. Doesn't have to be the next day. It's, as far as development goes, another area which I've always pushed myself really hard on is to subscribe to things or talk to people who don't agree with, or I don't agree with the way they look at things or the world. It's really easy to surround yourself by things which confirm your view of the world. It's a lot more confronting to surround yourself with things which are against your view of the world. I subscribe to a number of blogs and things like that where people have, in my view, awful views of the world. But they're things which I like to understand, that other people have those other views and things like that. If I just subscribe to things which have my view of the world, then all I'd do is reinforce my view of the world, and I wouldn't learn very much. There's a lot of different views out there, and talk to people who have different views, who do different things. The wider the circle of people you talk to, and the more you can learn about different people and different cultures and different ideas, which sounds a bit trite when you say it that way, when it sounded trite to me anyway. But do get out there and be challenged. It's the challenge and the change which makes the difference, and that's where your learning comes from. You don't learn anything from doing the same thing over and over again. I try and lead lots of biographies and things like that about different people and what they've done in their lives. I find, besides the fact I find them fascinating, they're often useful learnings and things like that of what people have done. And sometimes you may not take a direct learning out of it, but you will somewhere in the back of your mind, it sort of grinds away and you'll get something out of it, is my view on it all. My favourite blog I subscribe to, which is probably a reinforcing one rather than a challenging one, which I've mentioned to lots of people. It's called leadershipfreak.blog. It sends you like 20 lines a day about different thoughts on leadership. I find it really, really interesting because the way I operate, I can digest 20 lines in a day. If somebody gave me a whole book every day, I'd be in trouble. I'd never be able to do it. So something like that. I don't read them every day. Some days you're busy. But it's really well written by the guy who does it. So if you're looking for something which prompts people to, or prompts you to think about things, and they're real world problems he's coming across all the time. He's a trainer in that sort of area, and he just blogs out really sort of interesting stuff. So that's the most useful one I've ever come across as far as trying to get something which, I mean, the way I train tends to be a little bit continuously rather than lots of bits in a concentration. So they're probably the main things as far as development goes, but I would encourage everyone to try different things, look at different things, understand different things and different ways of looking at things. And try them out. Things work, things don't work, but it allows you to develop your leadership style a lot. And absolutely, as Anthony said, it's your leadership style you're trying to develop. You're not trying. You can take learnings from other people, and I always take learnings from other people. But you're not another person. You are who you are. I always find also mentorships really useful. I've always tried to have somebody who I can talk to as far as trying to sound out good ideas or bad ideas, or just complain about the world too, or whatever the case may be. That's really useful. And I've had different people at different stages. They've sometimes been peers, and sometimes they've been people who have been senior to me and things like that. But I find that a good sort of area just to have a chat about, seeing if what I want to try is reasonable or not reasonable. And the Institute has I think they still do. Do they still do? Is one source, but I mean, if you've got a good mate, that's as good as much as anyone else. Because really, the act of talking to someone about what it is actually makes it clear about what you want to do. The fact you have to express it and you get your thoughts straight often makes the answer pretty clear afterwards. So some sort of mentor or person you can talk to about what you're doing and where it's going who's not in your organisation. I'd encourage you to have someone who's a little bit sort of dispassionate or out in a different area is a really useful sort of tool as well.
Oh, thank you, Blair. Some really interesting points there. Particularly interesting how you've gone about having, I guess, diversity of thought for your own self. And I just wanted to maybe draw that out a little bit more, because diversity is very much a topical issue at the moment. And you talked very much about personal diversity. I guess there's also diversity within teams and the advantages of that. And I know, Anthony, you had some views on that, so maybe we'll start with you, and then if Blair's got more, he's going to
Yes, I might just pick up on Blair's point first, which is, so I think in terms of diversity of opinion, there's a couple of things. Winston Churchill once said, if you want to know what's going on, you should read the Daily Worker and the Financial Times, from the two opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think that's pretty good advice, actually. So there's that. But the other thing is diversity of professional opinion. I mean, we are actuaries and we have a certain way of looking at problems, an actuarial way of looking at problems. I think it's important for us to all aware that different professions see different problems quite differently. So I work with clinicians, for example, surgeons and radiation oncologists and medical oncologists and epidemiologists and psychologists and so on. And the interesting thing is that a lot of those professions use parts, if not, all of the core stuff that we think of as sort of actuarial, so the probabilities and all of those sorts of things. But they don't necessarily see it quite the same way. And I think, to the point about leading a diverse group of people, it's important to understand how an IT profession is going to look at the world one way compared to a creative director in an advertising agency. So I think those things are important. But to pick up on the diversity point, and I'm glad you raised it, because as I came in, I was looking at the wall over there, and those august presidents of the Institute of Actuaries of Australia, and noticing there were exactly 5 women on the board, and 3 of them have been presidents in the last 10 years. So Kathy Prime appears to be the first, followed by Helen Martin, and Kathy must have been a real pioneer. And I kind of look at the ethnic diversity of the blokes, and I think that maybe they share some things in common. So, and I think, that's really important as a profession, that we promote diversity. I mean, we live in a multicultural, diverse country. I think it's important that we embrace that and promote that in leadership. And it gives a diversity of opinion in teams, which my understanding of the research, at least, it's certainly my experience, actually is beneficial. I mean, people talk a lot on boards, for example, where you really screw things up quite badly is where, excuse for being a bit crude about this, but all the blokes on the old white blokes on the board all agree that it's all, obviously our answer is the following, and what they miss is the other perspectives, because they've all come from the same background, and so they all think the same way, and so they all come to the same conclusion. And particularly, people have talked about the benefits of gender diversity on boards. I went to a talk given recently by the Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, and he was talking about not-for-profit boards primarily, but he said, you also need to think about ethnic diversity. If you've got a board, and I think it doesn't just apply to boards, you need to make sure you've got somebody from a Chinese background or one of the Vietnamese background, one of the main larger multicultural groups in Australia. I think that's incredibly important, and I think, it's important as leaders that we show leadership in that regard.
It is, yeah, absolutely, because and age as well, because different people think about things different ways. But the one trap which people fall into sometimes, which is worthwhile thinking about, is tokenism as well. You don't want somebody there just because they've got only one leg and they come from some ethnic background, they've got some age profile or something like that. It's important to have them there because they can add value and they're happy to speak up and make their views known and participate in the whole process there. So the whole sort of diversity debate sometimes gets confused when people, especially if I can go to what you said, a bunch of old white males, pick someone just because you want someone of that sort of diversity there. So it's really important that that each of the different characters on boards do add that value. And it's really important for leaders to try and another way of saying what I was saying earlier is participate in things which try and understand what different ethnic groups, ages, sexes, etc. are doing, and if you can, participate in those types of things as well, because that will give you the experience about what they're looking at in a small element. You'll never fully understand, but it gives you a small element there, so that you can try and understand why it's important to have diversity there, because you will see there's so many different opinions and different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, and I think that thinking differently and being challenged for your thoughts is becoming more and more necessary. We're living in a world that's changing rapidly. If we only have to look at our traditional lines with general insurance, with emerging technologies and new risks, or in health insurance with the complexity of the products and the whole data analytics explosion that we've had. There's lots of change. So I guess that quite neatly leads into my next question. So with all this change that's happening around us, how do we as actuaries stay relevant and add value from a skill-based perspective? Yep, go.
I think it's interesting that people talk about explosions in data and things like that. Actuaries have been dealing in this sort of stuff forever. I think it's actually a core skill of actuaries in the way they look at data and utilise it, etc. It's one of those sort of trainings which a lot of people are catching up to. And if you look at the financial services, particularly insurance and areas where actuaries have had a big influence over the years, there's been a lot of big data analysed for a long period of time. A lot of the talk about the explosion in big data relates to industries which have never even looked at analytics before, and there's some good examples. There's of actuarial firms who've got into these areas where there's been less analytics done historically, and they've added huge value. I mean, Quantium, I mean, Taylor Fry, I don't know which other ones particularly, I know those two in particular have got into big data in industries outside the traditional insurance sort of industries and added massive value there. So what actuaries need to do is realise that data scientists are doing very similar work to what actuaries do a lot of the time anyway, maybe slightly more statistical around it than a lot of actuaries have traditionally trained to be. The profession's got a question to ask about how do we actually sell the skill sets we have currently. Just because we're not called data scientists, maybe if we all called ourselves data scientists, we'd be more marketable. But you might lose the identity then of actuaries. So the actual core skill set there, I think, is quite strong, and people need to make sure that they sort of understand what those different areas are doing. For instance, I wanted to understand what data scientists were doing, so the Institute of Actuaries kindly had a circular from some open university recently about a course which was all about data science. So I enrolled myself in it and read the course material. I didn't actually do the course, but I just wanted to understand what sort of material they're covering, which actually reinforced my view that actuaries and data scientists are actually very, very similar in what they're doing. They're trying to manage large amounts of data and take opinions out of it which can be used in the business. I think actuaries have one extra skill set which really sets them aside from a lot of data scientists, which is pushed really heavily in the educational aspect, which is the judgment element, which I don't think you necessarily get in so many other areas. And I think that's a huge value add which needs to be pushed, which can be pushed by the Institute to go that direction, just on that sort of subject.
I guess if we maybe just put the data analytics aside, I guess I was thinking our training provides us with some really great skills, obviously our numeracy skills, our ability to think sort of at a higher holistic level, our ability to take into account risk. To be more relevant and more valuable. I would think that it would be useful to couple those strong skills that we have with ability to collaborate with other professionals who can give, so if it's, you know, in climate change, an expert in climate change, to bring those skill sets together to then influence policymakers. So it's some of those soft skills, I think, would be make you a more valuable to the profession, to businesses and to the community. And Anthony, do you have some views on that?
Well, I think that that's right. I pick up on Blair's point. I think judgment is the thing. You know, there's an awful lot of data and an awful lot of, you know, big data and stuff like that. I've heard a number of senior marketing people at a number of large sort of retail operations in Australia talking about, for example, their rewards program and how fantastic it is and all the analysis they do and all that kind of stuff. And then you take out one of their cards and they just bombard you with crap every week for stuff, and you just think there's no data actually analysis really going on here. I think our core skill in a way is the ability to kind of look at the data and think through to the solution and apply judgment, and also to be able to, you know, what is a reasonable answer, why is it a reasonable answer, and what's the likely variation around that. So, I mean, when I started at our Watson & Sons in 1987, we were still doing things on big square pieces of paper, and we were taught to do evaluation in lots of different coloured biros, using factors and all of that kind of stuff. And in a sense, what the firm had built up was an expertise in doing calculations on big amounts of data in an era when there were no computers. So they used to do the post office valuation, superannuation scheme valuation, doing what they called a B sample. So they worked out that if you did all the people whose surnames began with B and ratioed up, you got a good answer. And some senior partner had some reason why B was the right letter of the alphabet. I can't remember now. But, you know, I think we've kind of got to forget that in a way. We've got to move on from that, because that's all fine, those skills, and they were barely applicable in 1987. But I remember at one point they said, we're going to have computers on everybody's desks, personal computers, but it's going to take 5 years because they're very expensive, you know, and in about 12 months everybody had a personal computer on their desk because the world just changed so fast. So I think what we've got to focus on is the fundamentals, which are those judgment and so on. But I agree with you entirely. I mean, kind of get out there more. That's one of my themes. So collaborate with other professionals. So I had an interesting conversation on Friday with a very senior epidemiologist who's trying to he's trying to provide some advice on this toxic foam stuff to a government thing. And he actually had quite a simple probability question, but he couldn't figure it out. And he said, "Oh, Anthony, you've got a maths degree, you must be able to do this." And I was pleased as punch to be able to give him the answer. That's a small point, but I think those kind of collaborations where you can bring our perspective but not be exclusive about it are very important, because we do as a profession have a lot to offer, but you know, there's a lot of competition between professions at the moment. So, for example, we do quite a lot of work in exercise for people with cancer, and you know, you've got your personal trainers, you've got your physiotherapists, and you've got your exercise physiologists. I won't go into the difference between all of those, but they're really butting up against each other, trying to explain to everybody why they're like fundamentally different professions. And I think that's a nothing game, really. I think what we have to do is, you know, get out there and use our skills and work with other people. So, you know, economists and epidemiologists, if you're in that space, psychologists, all those kind of people, whoever it is that you work with, the lawyers, the accountants, whatever. I mean, accountants are interesting. They seem to see the world in a quite odd way to me, but there you go. But that's their way of doing things, right? And I think we do need to collaborate with other professions, yes.
Well, I've got many more questions for you, but I better let the audience have some time to ask some questions. I have got one that's come through on the webinar from Richard Carter. What do you believe are the key differences between leadership and management? Maybe if just one of you, Blair, do you want to answer that one?
The ability to probably encourage and inspire people's leadership, management's telling people what to do, would be the way I'd view the two differences. Managing people is sort of a day-to-day type of, we've got 300 things we need to do, here's the top 50 we need to get sorted, and let's try and do these in the next week or so. Whereas leadership is trying to get them to take responsibility for things rather than you telling people what to do. Telling people what to do is not leadership in my view. The skill to do that is something you'll learn over time, and I think it leads back to a number of things we've discussed. Different people get led different ways, and you've got to figure out what the key points are to inspire some people, and it is different between different people, but you need to give them enough inspiration and also enough room for them to own the problem, not you own the problem. And you have to be able to, especially with actuaries, we've got a lot of training in technical areas and things like that. The easiest thing is to tell someone what to do, how to solve the problem. That's not leadership, that's management. Leadership is giving someone the problem and saying, can you bring me the solution? And if you're in trouble, come and talk to me. So letting them own the problem. And that applies to sort of any area. Where you're trying to get someone else to take responsibility for things and run through there. So I call it empowering people. You've got to empower them to surprise you. And I get surprised continuously how many people surprise me in actually doing far more than I ever expect. Because if you give them the room to do it, they'll do it. They'll take the responsibility and they'll do a far better job than you'll ever expect them to do. But the thing you have to do after that, when they come back with the solution, recognise them. They're the people who've got the solution. You should be the one there saying what a great job they've done, giving them the accolades. So there's definitely leaders around who then want to take the accolades for what's been achieved, etc. The best way to that's the best way to discourage people ever doing anything again for you. The best way to encourage them is that they've solved the problem. Give them the accolades. Make sure that everybody else knows that person solved the problem. Because then you'll not only inspire that individual, you'll actually inspire all other individuals to try and achieve things on their own and make things work, etc. So the more humble you are around other people's achievements, the better, I would say. So that comes down to really, do you understand emotionally what other people are feeling? So people generally term that EQ, emotional intelligence. Actuaries all have lots and lots of IQ because you wouldn't have got through the exams otherwise. But just making sure that you really focus on understanding what other people feel and what their feelings are about things, because it does change a lot. By people, and often due to how you view the world, you'll end up in different professions, etc. So understanding and trying to think about what motivates people down that sort of pathway is really important. And just walking around and talking to people. Other areas of the companies you work for or clients, or depends what organisation it is, just make sure you get out there and talk to people and find out what's really happening. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a senior manager and going around and sort of talking to the troops or something like that. Everyone should be out there talking to all their colleagues, etc., because that's really what you find out where things are going. So just keep in mind, encourage and inspire people, let people run with problems and sort them out themselves, and they'll produce the best answers for you, and they will nearly always surprise you about what they can do.
Oh, great, thanks Blair. We've got a roaming mic with a webinar. We're just going to try and get people to speak through the mic. Any other questions? Yes, down the front.
Hi, Ambassador Morris from Deloitte. Just had a quick question about, we often hear about leaders having a vision, kind of delivering on that vision. I'd be interested to hear from both of you the process you go through, firstly to come up with a vision, and secondly to test whether that's the right vision, and then to get buy-in from people to follow that vision.
I think that's a really great question. I was sort of thinking I might jump in at the end of what Blair said, all of which I agree with, and say that I think that strategy and the direction of the organisation is an important part of leadership. So, you take over as chief executive of something, or you take over a department, whatever, and it never quite happens like this. But if somebody says to you, well, you can do anything you want, what are you going to do? it's kind of a sort of a scary question in a way, because you spend most of your life basically doing what you're told by the people. So I think that's a very important component of leadership. In terms of how I work it for myself and my own organisation, first of all, I think it needs to be a collaborative process. So as you set a vision for an organisation, you have to work with people and bring them along and get their ideas, in my opinion. So it's kind of a workshop process. In fact, at my organisation, Martin Mulcair is actually helping us go through a process of that sort at the moment, just to realign our strategy going forward. But I think you need to do your homework. You need to think about the organisation. You need to think about the industry you're in, and you basically need to formulate your own opinion, I think. And to Blair's point, you kind of need to back yourself. And it's complicated. I mean, in my position, I've got to get my board to agree that I'm right, because I can't do what I think we ought to do without getting the approval of the board. And you've got to get the people who work in our executive team to follow us. And then I often think about it, when we were kids in a physics thing, you got these iron filings and you put them on the tray and you put the magnet underneath and all of a sudden they align up. And that's what you've got to get. You've got to get the whole organisation lined up like those iron filings. So it's an iterative process. And I think one thing I would say, I think you've got to write it down. So one of the things that I found in my life, not just in leadership, but you think you know what you're doing until you try and put it on a piece of paper and you go, oh crap, I didn't really think that through quite well. So I think it's a process of, so I'll tell you the process we're going through. I have developed some notes on what I think we should do in the next 5 years. I've shared that with our executive team. I've shared it with our chairman and deputy chairman. We're going through this facilitated process with Martin. We're going to have he's talked to a load of my executives. We're going to have a workshop. We're going to talk that all through. Hopefully we're going to land somewhere, and then we're going to write it up, share it, iterate it, so that we get to a position where everybody understands where we expect to be in the next 5 years. And more importantly, everybody understands the part that they play and the part that other people play. So one of the things that happens, it must just be something about human beings, is people kind of break off into teams. So I've got a fundraising team and a support and awareness community outreach team and a research team and so on. And before you know it, everybody's in their silos, only thinking about their own thing. The great thing is everybody fighting for real estate on the website. The fundraising people are going, well, we won't be able to raise any money unless we have a whole front page of the website, because that's what we need to do to raise all the money. And so to make sure that everybody understands that it's a collaborative effort, it's a team effort with different skills, different perspectives on the whole thing, and that they kind of got mutual respect and understanding for the different parts that different people are playing. That's what I would say.
I absolutely agree. They're getting the whole team involved in coming up with the direction. Now, sometimes you may have 90% of the idea about what you want, but it is important to bring the team along during the exercise. Coming up with the vision, it depends on where you are and what you're doing. If you're prostate Cancer Foundation charity, then it does define somewhat what your vision can be. It has to be in that direction, or else if you do something completely different, your people backing you'll probably get upset. It's been interesting as well with myself recently, with the ability to sort of think a bit more widely on what I can do. A lot of that then comes down to you and the people you're working with being passionate about it. You've got to do something you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about it, don't bother, go and do something else. So that will drive your vision a lot, is the passion. So once you've got that passion, if you can espouse it and write it down, as you said, which is really useful, everyone else will pick up on it, because if you're that passionate about it, then others will follow it, because it just makes so much sense if you really believe in it. So do something which you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about your job, my best career advice I've ever given to people is always go and do something else. You've got to really enjoy what you're doing. You spend way too much time at work to not enjoy it. So that applies to coming up with a vision for a company or whatever you're doing on a day-to-day basis, etc. So really love it, and when you love it, you'll do it so well that you'll always exceed expectations.
Just to add to that, and this has certainly happened to me, if you work through it all and you work out what you need to do, and you go to your boss and your boss says, no, we're not doing that, sorry, that's not what we do around here, then you're probably in the wrong place. Because you know, you do find yourself in situations in your career where the organisation just will not do the obvious right thing for whatever reason. Those are those constraints, you know, it's the legacy of the organisation, or it's other regulatory barriers, or whatever it happens to be, or just plain pig-headedness, who knows. But I think you do have to sometimes say to yourself, look, this organisation, you know, not all organisations are successful, and sometimes organisations kind of collectively do the lemming thing and jump over the cliff. And so if you're convinced that the organisation you work for is sort of going in the wrong direction and you really can't stand that, I think it's time to look for something else, to be honest. As Blair says, you know, I mean, you've only got one life, one career, might as well do something you enjoy, something you're passionate about.
Okay, we've probably got time for another question.
Thank you. Kate Lyons at Suncorp. Thanks for the talk today. It's been really fascinating to hear your experiences. You touched earlier on some of the hard decisions you had to make with restructuring or closing down offices, and now we're getting onto the do what you enjoy, what you're passionate about. What is it that you really enjoy and are passionate about as leaders?
For me, what I really enjoy is creating things, making things change, moving them forward. I'm really bad at doing things and structuring things and compliance and that sort of area. So I concentrate on doing the things I'm really good at and try and employ people to do the things I'm really bad at, which should apply to any job really. And that way, what I try and do is be as aware as possible of the bits I'm really bad at. I ask people what I'm really bad at and try and get people to tell me. Most people hate telling you what you're bad at because most people don't like relaying criticism. And if over time you might get a theme of things which you're good at and a theme of things which you're bad at. Generally the things you're bad at is because you hate them, and the things you're good at is because you love them. So do more of that and less of the other, and try and back yourself up with other people who are really good at doing those types of things as a way of getting to that sort of outcome.
Fixing things up is the answer in my case. So I've spent a lot of my career taking things that weren't necessarily broken, or I've taken on some things that were pretty close to, and making them work to my satisfaction, I suppose, or function properly. So that's what I really enjoy. I think just on that, if anybody is had got a similar sort of view on life, I think the trick, when you take on something that you think, you know, this looks pretty broken, but I think it can fix it up, is to think carefully whether you actually can fix it up or not. I think what you've got to be careful to do, I've turned down some things in my career where my estimation was there isn't the political will, if you like, or the organisational will to fix the problem. So if I take this, I'm only doomed to failure, and I think that's probably would be the most miserable place to be. I think what you've got to do is, but for me anyway, if you can take something which you think, look, this could be a whole lot better, I can see it could be a whole lot better, you know, we could be spending less money, we could be doing more great things, we could be, in my case, all of this benefits the community, that's really what drives me.
Any other questions? Yes, down the front.
Hi, I'm Daniel from QBE. Thanks for your talk today. It's been quite insightful. So I've got a question in relation to, I guess, resilience. I heard that resilience is a common theme in terms of how important it is to sort of back yourself. But there are times where too much resilience might be a setback. Maybe perhaps you're too stubborn in certain views. And have you ever sort of experienced that, and how you might sort of let back sometimes and admit that you might not always be right?
I don't think of resilience necessarily as stubbornness. That's more, I think stubbornness, the way I relate to things, and everyone's different, I think of stubbornness as more of making a decision and then stubbornly pushing on with that in spite of everybody else in the whole organisation telling you it's wrong. Occasionally you might be right, but if everybody's telling you it's not the right way to go, you better listen a bit. Resilience is more when things have gone wrong, being able to pick yourself up and say, hey, that happened, it's gone, I can't change the past, it's messed up greatly, or whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of good things in the future to do, rather than sort of worrying about the fact that it's all gone wrong. You can never change the past, it's happened. So you should always look at everything about what you can do now as far as the moment goes, and what the opportunities are moving forward. So you might have started a project and you've spent $10 million doing it and trying to make it work and everything else. And then suddenly something new comes along. Just because you've sunk millions of dollars into a project doesn't mean it's the best answer from now moving forward. There might be a better way to go. So don't anchor yourself to the past. Resilience is about trying to move forward to the future, and particularly I look at it from when things go wrong perspective, being able to not take that as such a big setback that you can't sort of look forward to the future and make it work better. So it's having that positive aspect to life, and which is really a general type of thing, because life's work and work's life. To a large extent, does interact a lot nowadays. So just pushing that way to be resilient, and also in respect to, I mean, sometimes you get criticised and things like that for what you've done. Again, be resilient to that. Try and take the positive out of it, because there's always a positive in most criticisms. It's hard to do at times, but if you can try that direction, you'll be a lot better off than if you just take it to heart and give up.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think resilience and stubbornness are different things. So resilience to me is, either the ability to bounce back or keep going. So in addition to what Blair said, I think just the ability to kind of put one foot in front of another in difficult times. So to give an example, for example, Alan Joyce and Qantas, when he came to that impasse and shut down the airline when I was sat on the tarmac at 5 p.m. in Melbourne, that must have been an extraordinarily tough time for him. He was under an enormous amount of pressure. Goodness knows what his chairman was saying to him, but we know what the media and the politicians were saying to him. But his ability just to, just go, I've got to work my way through this, and just keep going, because, I mean, he just kept going, and guess what? He's now one of the most kind of successful and popular CEOs in Australia. He could just have gone, this is all too hard, I give up at this point. It's just the ability sometimes just to kind of keep going. And sometimes you kind of keep going through situations that are not ideal. I'm sure Ian Narev is sort of sitting there today thinking about the sorts of things that are going on with the Commonwealth Bank, and I don't know anything about them, but I know what I've read in the press. And he's probably going, this isn't ideal, and he might be going, maybe the bank didn't exactly do the right thing. I don't know. But he's a chief executive. He can't, he needs to decide what to do and how to play it and how to move forward, and not to let everybody down, and kind of keep going in the best way that he possibly can. So that's resilience to me.
Probably time for one last question. All done. Well, there's lots of really useful insights. Thank you, Blair and Anthony. If everyone could just join me in thanking them for their time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.